Gentlemen, I have returned, and I come to you today as we find ourselves in the apex of spring. And I was going to complain about how hot it is, but today I guess it decided to rain, so here we are. Which can only mean that we are going to be talking about the Primarch Vulkan. As for how I drew that conclusion, I don't know, I'm not an artist. Anyways, on to Vulkan. Now, everyone likes Vulkan, and there's this notion in the community that Vulkan is a nice guy. This is true. Some people may try to counter that by pointing out some of his war crimes. This is fake news. As a war crime against Xenos, it's really an oxymoron when you think about it. As for the ones he's committed against humanity, well, I said he was a nice guy, I didn't say he was a saint. He's still his father's son after all. To be more exact, he was his 18th son, and he was born in a test tube on Terra with the rest of his Primarch brothers. And the Emperor had plans for Vulkan and his brothers. Those plans, though, got thrown in a shitbox at the same time baby Vulkan got thrown into the warp. How that happened was due to the Primarch's mother, Erda. Why it happened is because Erda learned of the Emperor's plans for their sons. I was gonna make a joke about how she was a crazy bitch that was crashing out, but that would be unfair. What happened was she realized the Emperor was more extremist than she first realized, and that is fair. The Emperor has proven multiple times that his reputation as an asshole is an earned one. So she found out what was happening, and she wasn't too thrilled with the idea of her sweet little Vulkan being the Emperor's immortal, eternal slave that he would use as a tool to expand his empire. So, she just said fuck it, and invited the Chaos Gods into the nursery. And the Chaos Gods would take Vulkan, his brothers, and throw all their Primarch asses into the warp. Baby Vulkan would come to land on Nocturne, where he would be adopted by Nibel. Nocturne is a death world. What makes Nocturne a death world is Nocturne's oversized moon, Prometheus. Now, in our world, the moon and its tidal forces pull on the Earth, and it creates the oceanic tide that rises and falls. On Nocturne, its tidal forces pull tectonic plates out of position, creating active volcanoes all over the planet. This is the main reason why the Salamanders have their fortress monastery on Prometheus instead of Nocturne. Because the same way our moon gives us regular tidal waves, their moon gives them regular volcanic cataclysmic death waves. So, to avoid this little inconvenience, they just hang out on Prometheus. My little gripe with that, because I'm a fucking nerd, gravity works both ways. So while Prometheus is a very big moon, Nocturne is an even bigger planet. So while Prometheus is pulling on Nocturne and shifting its tectonic plates, Nocturne should be pulling on Prometheus and ripping the moon apart. But I'm not going to hold the Roche limit against them. These guys fast travel through hell to get around, so I'm sure they work something out. I just thought it was an interesting little quirk. Vulkan would spend his childhood, which, for a Primarch that's like 7 minutes, working in his father's forge. And this is where Vulkan's love of the forge comes from. It started out he would help his father, then he started making his own stuff, then he started making new techniques and teaching new people. Things took a bit of a turn when the Dark Eldar showed up to raid Nocturne, and Vulkan was only 4 years old at the time, and Vulkan was already the size of a Space Marine. So Vulkan did what Vulkan do, and he beat them all to death with a hammer. The people of Nocturne then celebrate their savior, and they hosted a great tournament. And at this tournament, a new challenger approached. They would go up to Vulkan, challenge them, and say whoever loses has to serve the victor in perpetuity. Vulkan accepted, and they let the games begin. As for what they did, think of like the Olympics, but set in the Middle Ages and the Apocalypse. The first would be they would do an anvil hold, where they would pick an anvil up and hold it up over their head for as long as they can. And I just gotta say, you gotta wonder how many people died from this challenge. You're holding a heavy, awkward, large block of metal above your head for as long as you can until your arms are about to give out, and at the last moment you have to try to throw it to the side. I do not like the exit strategy of this operation. Vulkan and the stranger didn't need an exit strategy though. They stood there and held the anvil for hours until they both got bored, wanted to move on, so called it a tie. The games would continue for a few more days, and by the time they got to the end, they would be tied on the scoreboard with only one contest left. That contest would be to create a weapon from scratch, and then go out, hunt, and kill a salamander. And whoever brings back the largest salamander wins. Salamanders on Nocturne are not like salamanders like we know them. Their salamanders are the size of a small bus, breathe fire, and live in a place called Mount Deathfire. Vulkan would create a hammer, he would go out, beat his lizard, that's poor word choice, he would kill his salamander, and he would take it back home. But because it's Nocturne, a volcano randomly erupted, and it knocked Vulkan over, and he's about to fall to his death. Then the stranger would walk by with his salamander, and seeing Vulkan was about to die, he ditched his salamander and went over to save Vulkan. When they returned from Mount Deathfire, Vulkan conceded, he'd pledge his loyalty, and then the stranger revealed himself to be the Emperor. In other words, the Emperor did an Olympic-style tournament with his 4-year-old son, and when he beat Vulkan, he had him swear to serve him for eternity. Which is why I say Erda had at least some validity in her crash out. Now, Vulkan was found very young. I think he's like one of the very first Primarchs the Emperor actually found. Now, if I had to pull a number out of my ass, I would guess he'd be like the 3rd or 4th one. My point with this is that Vulkan still needed more time to grow up and learn, so he moved in with the Emperor and began his studies. When the time was right and Vulkan was ready, he would come to his legion's rescue, and now he would be Lord of the 18th. He would spend quite a bit of time and effort reorganizing his legion, both structurally and philosophically. He was able to bridge the divide between the first Terran-born salamanders and the new Nocturne-born salamanders. Which, doesn't always go well in other legions, but given that Vulkan's naturally a pretty likable guy, this isn't too surprising. Now at the head of his new reformed and united legion, Vulkan would take his place in the Great Crusade. Being in the Crusade meant that Vulkan would have to work with his brothers and their legions. And if there is one Primarch Vulkan can't stand, it's Konrad Curze and his Legion of Night Lords. As Vulkan was sold on the Great Crusade as a promise that it would unite, restore, and protect humanity. So to then see Curze and the Night Lords firing into crowds of civilians on a regular basis, this did not sit well with Vulkan. Still, Big E said they had to work together, and they would. Like the time they were sent to bring Karatan into Imperial compliance. Problem was, this planet was filled with humans that worshipped the Eldar. Curze then stepped forward and said, "Gentlemen, I have an idea." And his idea was terrorism. He would then slaughter an entire city. Vulkan wasn't a fan, so he reported Curze to Horus. Karatan was now compliant though, so no one really cared. Now it's time for Phase 2. It's time to separate the Xenos collaborators, and the non-collaborators, aka normal people. Curze then had another idea. The Night Lords secretly kicked off a riot between all sides, and in the confusion, they purposefully shot Vulkan's Remembrancer. So, with a full-scale riot broken out, the Eldar are trying to escape, shit's getting crazy, Vulkan and all the Astartes start cutting down the Eldar. And with his Remembrancer dead, Vulkan was thrown into a rage, which we don't see very often. So the Eldar were cut down, and when Vulkan found the last young Eldar witch, she raised her hands to surrender, and Vulkan was so mad as he believed the Eldar were responsible for the riot and the death of so many people, including his Remembrancer, that he decided we're taking no prisoners today and burned her alive. Why did Curze cause the riot and shoot the Remembrancer? Because he's an asshole and wanted to see what Vulkan would do. But, to his credit, Karatan no longer had an Eldar problem, and he got it done pretty quick. Now, people act like this is the worst thing Vulkan has ever done, and that is debatable. Because just before this, Vulkan literally burned down an entire world of humans, as they were considered impossible to bring into compliance. So, take the whole Eldar child-burning event for what you will. Fast forward a bit, and Horus is a traitor, and Vulkan is at Isfahan 5, aka the Drop Site Massacre. And the highlight of Isfahan 5 is when Perturabo stepped forward and said, "Gentlemen, I have an idea." And that idea was nuclear weapons, so he would nuke Vulkan and the Salamanders. Vulkan survived. His sons, not so much. Vulkan would then be taken prisoner by Curze. Konrad would then try to torture and kill Vulkan. What Curze didn't know was that Vulkan was a perpetual. Which means that he had Wolverine-like generation, but dialed to 16. Curze decided that if he couldn't kill Vulkan, he would destroy him mentally with torture and trials. And his final trial was a maze. And that's when, for the first time in our story, Vulkan had an idea. He would taunt Konrad, call him a bitch, and Konrad, being an edgy teen, couldn't take it. And so he entered the maze to kill Vulkan. Now, this time Vulkan is not restrained. So Vulkan did what Vulkan do, and he nearly beat Konrad to death with a hammer. After he did that, he teleported himself to the stratosphere of Macragge, and he came crashing down butt naked like a fucking meteor. Vulkan would regenerate. He was a little crazy though from all the torture, and he would go to beat up Curze again, and this time Vulkan again would be killed by a MacGuffin. So this time when he regenerated, he would no longer be crazy. Now healed, free, and sane, Vulkan went to Terra, where he would beat Magnus with a hammer. The Emperor would then go to fight Horus, he got crippled, put on the throne, and Vulkan would piss off for the next 1500 years, until the War of the Beast. I've mentioned him a little bit before, but the Beast was this massive, intelligent orc that was more like a Krork, and Vulkan would tackle the Beast into a generator, and then, you guessed it, crush the Beast's skull in with a hammer. And we haven't really seen much of Vulkan since. I mean, he is a perpetual, so we'll probably see him eventually. If Guilliman can come back, so can he. Now, as for Vulkan's cool gear, as a blacksmith, Vulkan made a lot of his own gear, such as his hammers. Vulkan made several, as you can imagine, but personally my favorite one is Dawnbringer, because it's a hammer with a built-in teleporter, and he used this hammer to beat the dog shit out of Kurz at the end of his torture session. His power armor is called the Drakenscale, which has a wrist-mounted flamethrower, and I'm not gonna lie, the green on this goes hard as shit. The other reason he made a lot of his own gear is because Vulkan is fucking enormous. I mentioned near the beginning how, as a 4-year-old, Vulkan was already the size of a Space Marine. Well, by the time he was fully grown, he was larger than every other Primarch, I mean, except Magnus, we don't really count him. But he dwarfed every other Primarch, and in raw physical strength, it's not even close. Vulkan, he is a monster. And that is why you see him able to beat the shit out of other Primarchs with his hammer, and there's not really a lot they can do about it. Anyways, his most famous creations are known as the Artifacts of Vulkan, and there are 9 of them. And it is believed that when the Salamanders find all 9 of them, Vulkan will return. Now, how his powers as a perpetual are linked to these artifacts, I have no idea. But every legion needs a hobby, so the Salamanders go around the galaxy trying to look for them, collect them, and right now they have 5 of them. They have the following artifacts. First, the Chalice of Fire, which, as its name does not lead you to believe, is a giant factory ship. It sits in orbit, you feed it some resources, and it spits out finished products. Next is the Eye of Vulkan, which is a orbital defense laser. Then you have the Spear of Vulkan, Khazar's Mantle, which is a Cloak Vulkan War. Finally, the Gauntlet of the Forge, which is a gauntlet with a built-in heavy flamer. The 4 missing ones are the Engine of Woes, the Obsidian Chariot, the Song of Entropy, and Unbound Flame. What do these do? Your guess is as good as mine. An artifact that we do know what it does is the Talisman of the 7 Hammers. The Emperor had Vulkan create this little device, install it on the Golden Throne, and what it's for is that in the event that Horus won, the demons under the palace got in, or the Emperor kicked the bucket for whatever reason, and now this situation is beyond all repair, on paper, the only person guaranteed to still be around when shit goes this south is Vulkan because he's a perpetual. So Vulkan has the job that, if it's actually beyond all repair, he needs to go and activate the talisman, in which case all of Terra will blow up and die a horrible death so nobody can have it. That hasn't happened yet. But at the same time, nobody's actually seen Vulkan for thousands of years, so I don't know if he'd randomly show up to activate it, but, you know, it's a dead man switch that we're not sure will still work, so that's great. But gentlemen, that's all I got for today. If you liked this video, I would appreciate a like. If you dislike this video, then by all means hit the dislike button. If there's anything you want to tell me, you can leave a comment, I read all of them. If you want to hear more from me in the future, you can subscribe. Until then though, fellas,